Hey, long time no see. It's Jeff here with a quick screencast on using quotations effectively in your rhetorical analysis, or how to quote effectively in your rhetorical analysis. And you can find the notes for this page down here in our schedule under here on quoting effectively. So, as mentioned here, I was taking a look at your rough drafts and trying to see what are some kind of problem issues that seem to be occurring. And there's really only two I think we need to talk about. We're talking about one today and one tomorrow. I'm also going to make a couple of quick screencasts for Friday, so you maybe want to look at those over the weekend as you work on revising your second project for the final draft, which we'll recall is due this coming Monday, to see if these things are happening in your paper and how you might prevent them from happening or how you might make the necessary improvements. But anyway, this one's going to be about how to use quotations effectively. So as mentioned here on this notes page, you can see that as I was going through, I'm relatively pretty happy. I think people are making the right decisions about quoting. They're quoting correctly. But just in case, I wanted to send you the direction of a couple of resources you could look at to kind of double check yourself, make sure you're on the right page, and then to go over just one or two things that I think are maybe important that we concentrate on when we're looking at our drafts during the revision process. Okay, so let's take a look. So in regards to resources here, I mentioned, or I linked here, the Purdue OWL page on quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing, as well as the Purdue OWL page on MLA citation. So if you're kind of confused about when you should quote, when you should paraphrase, when you should summarize, what kind of work quotations are supposed to do for you, and so forth, that first link's a good page to check out. If you haven't added in-text citations or works cited page, that second link would be a good one to check out. As mentioned, there's also a page in your Scenes of Writing textbook that gives you some examples of MLA citation. Now, all of you should be citing for this work, because even if you're only quoting from your source text, the book that you read, you're still going to need to cite that in your works cited page. And for the vast majority of you, you're also comparing that book with a shorter article written for a more specific or specialized audience by the same author. So you'd also have to cite that and include that in your works cited page. But, while that first link provides kind of general tips on quoting, paraphrasing, and so forth, I wanted to just cover kind of two questions about when to paraphrase, or sorry, when to quote, what quotes are supposed to do for us, and then how to handle particularly long quotations. So let's take a look. So as mentioned here, if you read this on your own, you'll see that I thought one of the, at least a potential weakness that is occurring in some of the rough drafts I looked at is that sometimes you're quoting things, quoting the direct words of your author from the text to kind of cover material that's rather general knowledge or isn't necessarily controversial, and it's not necessarily written in an interesting way. So the question there would be, why bother quoting at something if it's just kind of general knowledge? You could just state it in your own words. You wouldn't need to cite your source, right? And if it's not written in an interesting way, what does it tell us about how the author writes that would make it useful to a rhetorical analysis? Now that might seem a little ambiguous. How do we decide what's useful and what's not? So let's take a quick look at some examples. So here are two examples, and I used one of the Damasio books, one of the books by Antonio Damasio that was on our list to get these examples. So these would be examples of quotes that do nothing other than illustrate the author stating common knowledge. And I added this bad just so we're on the right page that this is something you shouldn't be doing. So here's a quote. According to Damasio, synapses can be strong or weak. So we quoted that, but that's just kind of general knowledge, or at least those of us who somewhat familiar with neuroscience know that. Even if we don't know that, it's not something you'd have to quote Damasio about, because he didn't make that discovery. That's just kind of background knowledge. It's established knowledge in the discipline that everybody knows. So why quote it? Here's a similar situation. So Damasio tells us that there is, quote, no questions that Gage's personality change was caused by blah, blah, blah. Here, if you're not familiar with this work, there's no reason you should be if you're not working on it for your project. He's talking about a kind of a famous case in the history of kind of proto-neuroscience. But anyway, particularly because he says right here, there's no question that this happened, we might have to ask ourselves a question, which is, why bother quoting Damasio on it? If we all know this, or if it's non-controversial knowledge, why cite Damasio? Why quote his own words? If it's useful information because you're doing a little bit of a summary of something to get into a certain strategy that Damasio uses, then you might mention it, but there's no need to quote it. But let's take a look at situations when it is useful to quote. So here's our second set of examples. So you see here, these are quotes that demonstrate the argument or perspective of the writing in a useful way. I guess maybe, of the writing itself or of the writer, right? So here's the same quote done twice for the Damasio textbook. So here you say, for most ethical rules and social conventions, regardless of how elevated their goal, I believe one can envision a meaningful link to simpler goals and to drives and instincts. So this is an important argument that Damasio is making, that kind of are questions of ethics and morals, which seem to be pretty divorced maybe from our animal nature or our existence as biological beings, are actually kind of connected. So kind of primal drives and instincts are relevant to ethics. So that's an interesting argument. It's an important argument to Damasio's text. So it's worth mentioning, and it's worth quoting Damasio there because you get to see how he is phrasing it, how he's using language like for most ethical rules and social conventions, how he kind of qualifies it or resists qualifying it by saying regardless of their goals, and then he uses words like I believe, right? So that kind of signals to us that he's stating, not so much an opinion per se, but maybe an argument that he's making. It's not necessarily a non-controversial point or perspective to hold. So it's worth quoting Damasio for that. Then here I just did the same thing again, used the same quote, but used it with a partial paraphrase. So maybe you think this is kind of a long quote, you're not sure what to do. So here I just rewrote it, where we have two quotes. We kept the envision a meaningful link, and we kept the no matter how elevated their goal, because those are kind of useful phrases from that quotation, but I just kind of wrote the rest of it in my own words. So that's an example of a partial paraphrase. There's some quotation there and some paraphrase. Make sense? Well, let's take a look at one more issue. Now, some of you are going to want to use quotations mainly to show the writing style or writing styles of the author. And the reason I put at least a potential S after style there is because, again, since one of the requirements for this project is to compare how the writer writes for a more general audience versus a more specialized one, we could presume they have two different styles for that. So if you're trying to describe how those styles are different, it might be useful to demonstrate that by having a particularly long passage or chunk of text from the two different works, and then comparing how the styles are different between the two, right? So here I've taken a passage from Angela's rough draft. She was nice enough to let me use it. And here she's not actually comparing the two different works, the general audience book and the specialized audience book, but just how style switches within the same text. But it would be just as useful a way to show a difference in style across two different works. But in any case, what we have here is kind of two long passages, and I put the quotations in yellow here. And you can see how if it wasn't in yellow, it might be difficult to pick them out because they're very long, and we use quotation marks to let the reader know we're quoting things. But if we have our first quotation mark and we go a very long time until the second one, we might forget that we're reading quoted material. So